It's amazing what they've found, isn't it? Truly amazing. And we're only going to see a fraction of what they've found. You go to the Israeli Museum, for example, and you will just see so much. For example, just about 3 or 4 years ago, they discovered the seal of Isaiah the prophet, the one who had 2 scrolls in the Dead Sea, his seal. And they found the seal of Hezekiah. They found the seal of so many kings, Manasseh. All of these are mentioned in the biblical records. They found the ossuary, the bone box of Caiaphas, the priest who tried Jesus in the Passion of the Christ. There is so much that they have discovered, especially in Israel, that they're finding all the time. All right, so let's go to the next one, the prophetic code. Alexander the Great was on his way to do battle with the Medo-Persians who were ruling Egypt at the time, because the Medo-Persians had taken over from the Babylonians, and Alexander the Great had come to power, and he was going to finish off the Medo-Persians. And on his way, he came to Jerusalem to destroy it because they were siding with the Medes and the Persians. But the priests of the temple there in Jerusalem came out of the city to meet him and said, Alexander the Great, you're going to beat the Greeks. You're going to beat the Medes and the Persians. And they showed him a prophecy, a prediction from the book of Daniel. Whereupon Alexander the Great decided not to destroy the city of Jerusalem, and he went on down to Egypt. Now, what caused Alexander the Great to change his mind and not destroy the city of Jerusalem? What was in that prediction? Well, we'll see that in this presentation in a little moment. So far we've noticed historical accuracy. Now we're going to look at the prophetic side of it, but dealing in this section with just ancient predictions. Then in our next prediction, we're going to see predictions that deal with our own time right now, right down into the 21st century. So the prophetic reliability, is that the case? What's the evidence? All right, let's begin by going to Egypt to get a little taste of the predictive accuracy. When you come to Egypt or read in the biblical writings, there are many predictions about ancient Egypt, quite a number of them. Here are 2 or 3 of them. One, the papyrus reed prophecy. Now, papyrus plant grew prolifically on the banks of the Nile in ancient times. We just moved house to Cherrybrook, and we have a nice big park there, and there's lots of papyrus around there. But this once grew prolifically along the Nile. You can even see it on the inscriptions of the tombs and temples. See it here? This is some of the paper and some of their tombs and temples. The papyrus was a very important symbol for the ancient Egyptians. They made paper from papyrus reeds, and they exported it. It was very important to them. They made their boats, many of their boats, from papyrus, not the ones you see today like this one. You can't get it today, but they once made it. Now, the Bible predicted 700 BC, 2,700 years ago, that the papyrus reed would die out in Egypt. And here's the prediction from Isaiah. He's in the Dead Sea Scroll collection, remember, his writings. The paper reeds, that's the papyrus, the reeds by the brooks, by the mouth of the brook, shall wither, be driven away, and be no more. Well, that was the prediction made by Isaiah, 700 BC. Now, you can go to Egypt today and you won't find papyrus growing on the Nile in Egypt. You will find it in other countries where the Nile flows, but not in Egypt. For some reason, it's just not there, but it is in other countries. At least it's not growing prolifically. You won't find much at all. So what happened to it? Well, Thor Heyerdahl, some of you may remember this man. He was a explorer from somewhere in Norway, Denmark, one of those countries, Scandinavian countries, and he was an adventurer type. So he decided to go to Egypt to get some papyrus to make a papyrus boat and sail it. You've probably read about that, the Kon-Tiki expedition. Well, when he got there, he couldn't find any, and this is what he said. Notice what Thor Heyerdahl said. Pharaoh lies in his tomb with reed boats painted on the stone walls. Stone in the desert and reeds on the shore of the Nile. Stone and reeds were nature's gift to the ancient peoples of the Nile. But then he said, no papyrus grows in Egypt now. Not a single golden-haired papyrus reed bowed its bushy head over the bank to mirror itself in the brown water. Papyrus had died out in Egypt. No one knew why. The gods had taken back one of their oldest gifts, he said, as if they had simply pulled it up by the roots. Rather interesting. And you won't find it there today. You find a little bit here and there, but it doesn't grow any more prolifically. They plant a little bit of it so they can make some paper for the tourists. Yet you'll find when you go to the shops. But here's a bit out the front of the Cairo Museum. This would remind people that once this plant grew prolifically on the Nile, but does so no longer. Then there's the Memphis prediction, made 600 BC by the prophet Jeremiah. Let's have a look at it. Now, Memphis, by the way, was the capital of Egypt for some 500 years. It was no mean city for the Egyptians. But this is what the prophet Jeremiah predicted. Pack your belongings for exile, you who live in Egypt, for Memphis will be laid waste and lie in ruins without inhabitant. Now, I take people to Memphis, and I guess some of them scratch their heads as to why I take them there, but I take them there for this point. This is about the best thing you'll find in Memphis, this alabaster sphinx. There's bits and pieces around, a little bit of ruins that have been excavated recently, but not much, and this is pretty much Memphis. It's sort of vanished, almost. In fact, Amelia Edwards, an Egyptologist, some years ago wrote these words. She said, "Where are the stately ruins which even in the Middle Ages extended over space of half a day's journey in every direction? One can hardly believe that a great city flourished on this spot or understand how it should have been effaced so completely." Wow, you just don't see it. All right, what about this last one for Egypt? This is the Thebes prediction. Now, Thebes is mentioned many times in the Bible, a number of times, and it's what we call Luxor today. All right, this was the prediction made about Thebes, one of the great cities. This is across the Nile, was where they found the Tutankhamun's treasures. "I will lay waste Upper Egypt, set fire to Zoan, another city, and inflict punishment on Thebes." It doesn't say Thebes will become desolate without an inhabitant, and it's certainly not today, and the ruins are there, but the city was certainly inflicted with some sort of trouble, obviously. These are the ruins of the Temple of Karnak. There are two great temple complexes in Luxor, the Temple of Karnak, the Temple of Luxor, joined by an avenue of ram's-headed sphinxes, which are symbols of the god Ammon-Ra. Now, this is the biggest sun temple complex dedicated to sun worship that we have in the world, is the Temple of Karnak. But here it is, just as the Bible said, it doesn't say it would be laid waste and no inhabitants and so on, but it said it would be punished, and we can see this is the case today. Many people still live in the ruins or outside the ruins of those cities, the ancient cities. So prophetic accuracy. Let's go to this ancient Babylon now, and this is where we encounter Alexander the Great now. Because it was from Babylon that this prediction that we're going to look at, that he was shared with, was made by the prophet Daniel. In the 8th chapter of the book of Daniel, we have an amazing prediction that just boggles the mind. You see, the book of Daniel was written in the 6th century BC, so let's say 2,600 years ago. Now, before we get into the prediction, I want you to see clearly that this book was written in the 6th century BC, because there are many predictions that people claim as predictions in some writings that are written after the event happened, made to look like a prophecy. But this is clearly not the case with this. This book was written in the 6th century, not written way after, and said to be a prediction. So let's have a look at the evidence. Well, first of all, Jesus of Nazareth talked about the book of Daniel in the 1st century AD. So it's at least that old. He quoted from it when he was making predictions about the future, and we're going to see that in one of the presentations, some of the things. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, the book of Daniel was one of their favourites in their collection. Lots of pieces of the book of Daniel found in the Dead Sea Scrolls clearly they were interested in this book. And so that dates back to the 3rd century, because that's 200 BC. We call it the 3rd century. So it's that old. But it's older than that, because Alexander the Great was shown the book of Daniel, and he's living in the 4th century BC, the 300s BC. But it's even older than that. And we know it's older than that because there are details in the book of Daniel that could only be known in the 6th century. Let me share with you a couple of them. You've probably heard the famous story of the writing on the wall. On the last night of Babylon, suddenly while they're having a big party, a hand without a body started to write on the plaster of the palace wall, it says in the 5th chapter of Daniel. And this famous painting by Rembrandt pictures that event where that hand is writing on the wall. And it says in the 5th chapter of Daniel, Daniel says the last king of Babylon was Belshazzar in that chapter. And historians read that and they said, wrong, that's a mistake, that's a blunder, we can't trust the Bible, because we know it was a king called Nabonidus. He was the last king of Babylon. Well, when archaeologists got to work, and they said, they hadn't heard of this guy Belshazzar, had no record of him. Once the archaeologists got to work in Iraq, they discovered this cylinder, the Nabonidus cylinder. It's about so big, so round, and it's in the British Museum today, and it says that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus. So now they knew there was a guy called Belshazzar, but was he the king? That's another question. Well, they kept digging, and they discovered this famous Nabonidus Chronicle. And what does this say? It says this: Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to Belshazzar in the 3rd year of his reign. You see, we now know what happened. Nabonidus seems to have been some sort of a religious recluse. He was the king, but he decided to go out and do his religious thing in Saudi Arabia at a place called Tema. And he said, boy, you're the king of Babylon while I'm not here. So he was a co-regent, we call it, and the scholars could see the Bible was correct. They had to change their history ideas. The biblical writers were correct. Now, in that party that they were having, the king said, if anybody can read this writing and tell me what it means, because it's an omen of the future, he thought, I will make them the 3rd ruler in the kingdom, you see, it said. Now, of course, whoever wrote this knew about this, because who's the first ruler? Nabonidus. Who's the second? His son Belshazzar. So he says, you can be 3rd if you can tell me this writing. You see, clearly the evidence from the biblical writings and archaeology show us, yes, the Bible got it right, historians were wrong. Only known if you lived in the 6th century, because they never knew that. All right, the final point that shows us it's 6th century is that the book of Daniel has written in 2 languages, parts of it, part in Hebrew and part in Aramaic. And scholars have looked at the sort of Aramaic, and it's clearly a 6th century Aramaic language. So we know it was written before the events it talks about. That's why I went through that with you. I want to make sure you get that. So, the book of Daniel, the 8th chapter, comes from the 6th century BC. In this chapter, he pictures a war between a ram and a goat. He tells us very clearly that the ram represents Medo-Persia. He says he's told, the ram which you saw in your vision or your dream, having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Now, we know that the Medes and the Persians were a dual empire. Media, the Medes, and the Persians. In fact, Daniel was told this. He said, then I lifted up my eyes, and I saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other. So this 2-horn ram, one's higher than the other, and he says, and the higher one came up last. Now, when Daniel has this vision, the Babylonians are still ruling. They've got a few years to go yet, but he talks about what power's coming next. Now, that's exactly what happened. First of all, the Medes were the dominant partner in this combined union. And then they had a big fight between Cyrus, who was a Persian, and Astyages, who was a Mede. And Cyrus beat Astyages, and now the Persians took control of this dual empire, and it went on much longer under the Persians. They were the dominant partner, and they came up second. So the Bible got that right. This was very important. I saw, he says, the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. And we know that's what happened with the Medo-Persians. They went north up toward the Aral Sea and up toward through the Caspian area. They went west into Greece, in fact. They invaded Greece at least twice. Once under Darius the Great, where they had that battle at Thermopylae with those Leonidas and his guys. What was it, 700, 300? I've forgotten what. 300. I'm embellishing the figures here. 300, they got beaten because someone turned traitor. They went west, no question, and they went south to Egypt. That's where they conquered the Egypt as well. So the Bible got that right. Then he was told that the goat represents Greece. Notice what it says here. The male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that's between its eyes, one horn, this is the first king. Now everybody knows that the first king of the United Greek Empire was Alexander the Great, thanks to the help from his father Philip of Macedon. So Alexander the Great united the Greek Empire together under him. And that's why you can now see that when Alexander the Great came to Jerusalem, the priests told him this story, this prophecy. They said, Alexander, we got good news for you, sir. You are going to beat the Medes and the Persians, because our book predicts that. 200 years ago this prediction was made by Daniel, because that's when it was made originally, 500s. Now it's 300. You're going to win. Well, he thought, well, I like that. So he said, I'm not going to destroy your city. So you can understand now. Now let's continue. Daniel's talking Daniel's seeing the interpretation here. He's told, therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken. In other words, this king dies. And in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven, the 4 points of the compass. Then he says, as for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. Now, when Alexander the Great died, he died in Babylon, actually. And when he died, his vision of a great Greek empire died with him. It ended right there, because his generals, after his death, fought among themselves and succeeded in breaking Greece into 4 regions, just as the prophet Daniel had predicted over 200 years before. Greece is going to be divided. That nation will be divided into 4. Well, let's go to the last part of this prediction now. 4 notable ones, 4 horns came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And then it says out of one of them, that means out of one of the 4 points of the compass, out of one of the winds of heaven, came a little horn, which grew exceeding great. Medo-Persia was great. Greece was said to be very great. And this next power was exceeding great. Exceeding great toward the east, toward the glorious land, toward the south, toward the east, toward the glorious land, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled on them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary or temple was cast down. He also shall stand against the Prince of Princes, which is a reference to the Messiah. Now, what's all that about? Some of you are probably glazed eyes right now. What does that mean? Let's go through it piece by piece so we can all see it clearly. Number 1, this little horn. What is this little horn? Well, what was the power that defeated the Greeks? Rome, exactly. You just check this up on any history book. And that's what happened. The Romans did it. How do we know it's Rome? How do we know it from the prophecy? Well, he gives us the points. The actions tell us it's Rome. Number 1, it went south to Egypt. Did the Romans go there? Yes, you rode Mark Antony, Cleopatra, and all of that stuff that the movies love to talk about. Then it went east to Mesopotamia. It sure did. When I take people to Iran, we go to a place where one of the Roman emperors decided to go, and he got captured by the Persians and never came back to Rome again. They certainly pushed into the east to Iraq and beyond into Iran. It went to Israel, called the Glorious Land. In 63 BC, Pompey marched the soldiers of Rome into what we would call Palestine and Jordan and Israel, in that area, and they stayed there from then on for many years. It was greater than Greece. It was exceeding great. The Greeks were toppled by the Romans. It stood against the Messiah, or the Jesus Christ. You've seen Mel Gibson's blockbuster movie, I'm sure, The Passion of the Christ. Who crucified Christ? It was the Romans that crucified Jesus. Of course, the Jews asked them to do it, but the Romans did the job. It was Roman governor who tried Jesus. It cast down the sanctuary. The sanctuary is a fancy name for the Jewish temple. And we're going to see that. I'll take you to this fight that they had in another presentation, because it's very important to what we're talking about here tonight. 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem that had been rebuilt. It took away the daily temple services, because you got no temple, no services can take place inside the temple. And that all occurred at 70 AD, of course. But it also trampled on God's people. That's the host and the stars. That's the symbols of God's people. It trampled on them. How do we know the Romans did that? Well, everybody is familiar, nearly everybody, I should say, with the Colosseum. Now, this is a famous place where many Christians were butchered, but more of them suffered just down the road at the Circus Maximus. Scores of Christians were killed by the Romans for their games. You see, the Romans loved violence. They feasted on fights in the arenas. They would watch it, not just on television. They would watch the real thing, where the gladiators killed each other. And they loved it. And if a gladiator fought a good fight, two guys fought, they'd put thumbs up. If they thought he fought a poor fight, put thumbs down, and he'd run him through with a sword, the guy who won the fight. And the Romans loved it. Well, part of the entertainment, especially at night, was the Christians. They would take the Christians and bring them into the arenas and set wild dogs on them and lions. And this was entertainment for the Romans. Some of them they would crucify, put on crosses, pour tar over them, set a light to them so they could have games at night. I mean, this was Roman thing, and that's what Daniel had predicted. It will trounce the people of God. All right, now I want you to think as we wrap this up and go to dinner. Very precise fulfillments of prophecy we have here, very precise. For example, Medo-Persia, predicted by name, would take over from the Babylonians, and they did. It mentioned that Greece would come next, and this is 200 years or 250 years down the track yet, and they did. Could have been anyone else, could have been the Hittites, could have been who knows who it could have been. Then on the death of the first king, Greece would be divided into four, and it was. That's what history shows us. Then, of course, that little horn, the exceeding great one, Rome replaced the Greeks. That's what happened. They did go south to Egypt. They did go east to Mesopotamia. They did go to Israel. They did kill the Christ, and they did destroy Israel's temple and take away the services, and they killed Christians. All of those things predicted back 600 years before Christ, roughly, 500 to 600 years. Now, either this is a hoax or there's something supernatural going on. You can't make these predictions about Egypt, about this one here, about the Babylonians and the Medes and the Greeks. You can't make these predictions so far ahead unless you're getting some insights from somewhere. Now, for me, I mean, we haven't seen anything yet. This is nothing compared to what you're going to see after dinner. I mean, we're going to look at some high-octane predictions here that you just have to say something supernatural's going on here. This is amazing. Now, for this reason, and you'll see as we move into our own time, because that's where we're going to be looking at, the most reliable source for knowing the future is certainly the biblical records. It's got historical accuracy, and as we're going to see even more, it's got tremendous prophetic reliability. It's got a batting average of 100%. Which is what you'd want. Now, there are 800 prophetic verses in the Bible. 90% of them have already been fulfilled with past civilizations and events of the past. That means there's only 10% left. And this 10% deal with our time, you're going to see, and what's soon to take place. And that's the bit we're going to focus on, because it's the 10% that have predictions concerning our time. And so after dinner, we're going to get into that, and we're going to start moving, and you'll say, wow, this is incredible. What's coming to our world? So their next presentation after dinner, The Last Empire, and then we continue on.